The rain had started around sunset, a slow, creeping drizzle that turned into a steady downpour by nightfall, as if the sky couldn't hold back its own sorrow anymore. I hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days, not a word, not even to the barista, who handed me my black coffee, or the neighbor who nodded with forced politeness in the hallway. My phone was off. Not dead, just turned off. Because I couldn't stand the blinking notifications, the unread messages I couldn't answer, the fake smiles frozen in photos. Like and subscribe, and write into the comments where you're watching this video from. If this reaches just one soul who needs it, then maybe this story still has purpose. I remember counting the steps, not because I was superstitious or because it mattered, but because it gave me something to focus on, something other than the constant screaming inside my head. There were 217 steps from the bus stop to the bridge. I counted twice. Each step felt like walking through water, like gravity had doubled just for me, just for this night. The bridge was empty, except for puddles that reflected the yellow street lamps like broken mirrors. My coat, heavy from the rain, clung to me, like a second skin, cold and unwelcome. I had written the note 2 nights before, plain, unremarkable, tucked in my jacket pocket, addressed to no one and everyone. It said I was tired, which felt like the most honest sentence I could ever write. No melodrama, no blaming anyone, just an admission of defeat, like whispering checkmate in a game I never agreed to play. I walked to the edge, placed both hands on the slick railing, and stared out at the black water below. It wasn't fear I felt, or even sadness, just an unbearable weight in my chest, pressing, suffocating, constant. The sound of rain on metal was rhythmic, hypnotic, as if it were lulling me to sleep. I closed my eyes. I whispered goodbye, not to anyone in particular, just to the wind, to the world, to whatever might be listening. And just then, in the middle of that silence, I heard it, the softest shuffle, a splash, a pause. I opened my eyes, annoyed, and turned my head slightly, expecting a raccoon, maybe a stray cat. But there he was, a dog, medium-sized, muddy, with a tattered red collar hanging loose around his neck like an old memory. He wasn't barking, just staring, ears down, body low, as if unsure if he was allowed to exist. He took a step forward, paw pressing into a puddle that rippled toward me like a question. I said, "Go away," but my voice cracked halfway through, barely louder than the rain. And then he sat, right there in the wet, not more than 5 feet from me, and he tilted his head to one side like he was trying to understand the shape of my pain. I turned back toward the water, gritting my teeth, trying to refocus. But then, a whine, soft, trembling, almost apologetic, like he was asking for something he didn't think he deserved. And then he moved forward again. I didn't stop him. Maybe I wanted a witness. Maybe I just didn't care anymore. But when he reached me, he didn't bark or jump or do anything dramatic. He simply leaned in, slowly, gently, and laid his head on my lap. Warm, real, alive. I didn't know when I started crying, only that I couldn't stop. It wasn't just tears. It was sobbing from the marrow of my bones, from places I had buried so deep I forgot they even existed. And still, he didn't move. Not even when my body shook, when I doubled over, clutching his fur like a lifeline I never asked for. I remember thinking, he's going to run. He's going to leave, like they all did, but he didn't. He just stayed. Like he had nowhere else in the universe to be, no better place, no higher calling than keeping his head on the lap of a stranger who wanted to vanish. Eventually, the cold got sharper, the kind that bites under your skin, and I realized we were both soaked through. I whispered, "You don't even know me." He didn't answer, of course, but he licked my hand once, slow and deliberate, as if to say, "That doesn't matter." I looked around, the street still empty, the bridge still silent, and I felt the moment shift. Not dramatically, not like lightning. More like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally letting go. I pulled my knees to my chest, and he climbed closer, curling himself around my legs like a blanket made of trust. There was no plan now, no clarity, but also no urgency to die. Just the presence of something that needed me, maybe only in that moment, but it was enough. And when the rain lightened and I could see my own reflection in the puddle again, I saw something I hadn't in months. Someone still there. Someone seen. Someone not yet gone. I picked him up, trembling, muddy, eyes full of old pain, and whispered, "Let's get out of here." I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know if I'd make it through the night without falling back into that darkness. But I knew I couldn't leave him alone now. Not the dog who laid his head on my lap when I was about to disappear. He saved me, not with words but with presence, and for the first time in a long time I thought, maybe saving someone else could be the reason I start saving myself. We walked slowly away from the bridge, both of us stumbling like survivors crawling out of a wreck. My legs felt heavy, but my chest, for the first time in months, didn't feel like it was going to collapse in on itself. I didn't speak, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what to say to him, to this muddy, trembling soul who had rewritten my ending with a single gesture. I kept glancing down at him as we walked, him, limping slightly, fur matted with grime and rain, but staying close like he was afraid I might vanish if he looked away. When we got to my building, he hesitated at the bottom of the steps. It was as if he didn't believe he was allowed inside, like someone had once taught him that doors were meant to stay shut to things like him. I knelt beside him and gently touched his head, brushing the soaked fur from his eyes. He flinched. "Just barely." And I felt my heart split at the thought that someone had hurt him before. I whispered, "It's okay. You're allowed in." And I opened the door. He paused, then walked in with the smallest wag of his tail, and something about that broke me again. Not the sad kind of breaking, but the kind that makes room for something new. Inside my apartment, everything was still dark, still quiet, still untouched by life, dishes unwashed, blinds drawn, a world frozen in time. But when he stepped onto the rug, shook himself off, and gave the smallest sneeze, it was like watching color bleed back into a black and white photograph. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and knelt in front of him. He didn't resist, as I began drying him off, his eyes half closed, leaning into my touch like he'd been waiting his whole life to be cared for. Each stroke of the towel felt like a prayer, like a whisper to the universe that maybe we both had more time than we thought. And when I finished, he licked my wrist again and laid down right there on the hardwood floor with a sigh that sounded like relief. I didn't have dog food. Hell, I barely had anything in the fridge for myself. A few eggs, stale bread, an expired container of yogurt I couldn't bring myself to throw away. But I found some leftover chicken from 2 nights ago, warmed it slightly, and placed it on a plate beside him. He didn't devour it. He looked at me first, waited, like he needed my permission, like trust was still something delicate between us. When I nodded, he ate slowly, gratefully, pausing between bites as if savoring every piece. I sat on the floor nearby, knees to my chest, watching him in silence, not realizing I was crying again until a tear hit my arm. It wasn't the sharp, gutting cry from before. This one was soft, steady, a quiet unraveling of everything I'd been holding inside, because for the first time in forever, I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I grabbed an old blanket from the closet, laid it on the floor beside him, and curled up there, my hand resting on his side. He pressed closer in his sleep, the warmth of his body a comfort I didn't know I needed. And I dreamed, not of falling, not of darkness, but of a light at the end of a hallway I hadn't walked in years. The next morning, I woke up to soft snoring and a puddle of drool on the blanket, and I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like centuries. He lifted his head, ears perked, and looked at me like he was trying to remember who I was. "Good morning," I whispered, and I swear. He smiled. I didn't know what to do next. I hadn't planned for next, but I knew I had to get him checked out. He was limping, thin, and there was something in his eyes that worried me. I called the nearest vet clinic, explained that I found a stray who needed help, and the receptionist, bless her, didn't ask for much else. We walked there together, slow but steady. Every now and then he'd look up at me like he still couldn't believe I hadn't left. At the clinic, the vet, a kind woman named Dr. Lang, knelt and greeted him like he mattered. She asked me what his name was, and I froze, because I hadn't named him. Because naming him meant he was real, that he existed beyond that one moment on the bridge. And somehow, without thinking, I said, "Lucky." She smiled and said it fit. They did some tests, checked his legs, cleaned his ears, and she told me he was older than he looked, about 8, maybe 9. He had some damage to his left paw, likely from an old break that never healed properly. She asked if I was planning to keep him, and my heart answered before my mouth did. Yes. It wasn't a question anymore. He had saved me, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but literally saved me from disappearing into the dark. How could I not keep him? We walked home under a gentler sky. The rain gone now, replaced by light filtering through clouds like hesitant hope. The world hadn't changed, but I had. Not completely, not magically, but enough to keep walking, enough to try, enough to feed, something other than my despair. That evening, I went to the pet store, shaky, anxious, barely holding myself together. But I got food, a leash, a proper bed, and a tag for his collar with the name Lucky carved into it. The cashier smiled and said, "He's lucky to have you." I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, thinking, no, I'm the lucky one. When we got home, he curled up in his new bed like he'd been waiting years for a place to finally be his. I sat beside him, running my fingers through his fur, whispering stories I hadn't told anyone in months, about my dad, my first heartbreak, the way silence became my only language. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just listened. And that night, when I turned out the lights, I realized the bridge wasn't my ending, it was my beginning. Because of a dog who saw me. Because of a moment I almost didn't survive. Some people think healing is a straight path, like once you decide to live, you just keep getting better every day. They don't see the cracks that remain, the pieces that never quite fit back the way they used to. They don't see how even with a dog curled up at your feet, even with laughter returning in fleeting bursts, there are still nights that swallow you whole. Some of you watching know what I mean. Like and subscribe if this speaks to you, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, because I want to know who you are. The days after I brought Lucky home were quieter than I expected. Not empty, never again empty, but filled with the kind of silence that doesn't hurt. He followed me from room to room like he didn't trust the world to let us stay together. And maybe I didn't trust it either. There were good days, days where I got out of bed before noon, where I took him on walks and watched the sun filter through the trees like golden lace. We had routines, his soft bark at 7 a.m., his tail thumping when I poured food into his bowl, the way he'd nudge me if I forgot to take my meds. He became my shadow, my anchor, my reason. And then there were the bad days, days where the weight came back, heavy and mean, like a storm that had only been waiting for me to lower my guard. I would wake up and feel nothing, not sadness, not pain, just blank. Like I was standing at the edge of the bridge again, staring into nothing, only now that darkness was inside the walls of my own home. On those days, I wouldn't answer texts. I'd ignore phone calls. I'd sit on the floor for hours, staring at nothing, feeling like I was slowly disappearing. And Lucky would come over every time like he had some sixth sense for when the world got too loud in my head. He'd sit in front of me, nose against my arm, not demanding, just being there. A living heartbeat saying, "Stay." One night, the worst one since that bridge, I found myself back on the fire escape. It was 2 in the morning, and I couldn't breathe, like the air had been drained from the whole planet. My hands were shaking, my legs numb, and the thoughts, "You don't matter, you're not enough, no one would notice." They came back, louder than ever. I stood up, stared down, 5 stories below, city lights flickering like they were trying to blink me away. Then I heard it, the scratch of paws against the floor. I turned, and there he was, pressed against the window, his eyes wide, his ears back, whining so softly it almost broke me in two. He looked at me like he didn't understand, like he couldn't understand how I could forget that he needed me. I opened the window. He crawled out onto the fire escape, not supposed to, not safe. But he did it anyway. He nudged my knee with his nose and then just leaned into me, like he was trying to push me back inside with his body, and something inside me gave way. I sat down. I pulled him close. I cried into his fur again, not because I was broken, but because I realized how close I had come to forgetting that I wasn't. He licked my cheek, whined again, and I whispered, "Okay, okay, I'm here." After that night, I made a rule. Whenever the darkness started to rise again, I would say his name out loud. Lucky. It sounds small, doesn't it? But sometimes small is all you have. And every time I said it, he would come running, tail wagging, like a soldier reporting, for duty. He made friends in the neighborhood. People noticed him before they noticed me. The mailman who started bringing dog treats, the girl at the cafe who wrote "Good Boy" on our coffee cup lids. It was strange being seen again. Strange how it didn't hurt as much anymore. One afternoon, an older woman in the park stopped to pet him and said, "He has kind eyes. Dogs like that, they always know pain." I asked what she meant. She looked at me and said, "The ones who survive it, they carry it with them, but they never stop loving anyway." And I thought, maybe that's what we have in common. He had scars, just like me. He didn't need to tell me about them. I could see it in the way he flinched sometimes when voices got too loud. In the way he watched me closely when I moved suddenly, like he was afraid I might raise a hand, even though I never would. I wondered how many people had failed him before he found me. We had both been thrown away by someone, and we had both chosen, not all at once, not cleanly, to live anyway, not just to survive, but to stay. Every month that passed, something small shifted. I began writing again, stories at first, then journal entries, then the beginnings of something that felt like purpose. I went to therapy. I brought Lucky with me. He would curl at my feet while I said things I hadn't said in 10 years. He was my silent witness to my return to life. I started responding to texts. Started calling my sister again. Started remembering to eat, not just feed him. It was slow, imperfect, but real. One morning, I caught him lying in a sunbeam, belly up, snoring like a tractor, and I laughed so hard I scared him awake. He leapt up, startled, and I ran over, kissed his head, and said, "You scared me too, you ridiculous potato." He wagged his tail so hard he knocked over a lamp, and we just stood there, in a mess of sunshine and broken ceramic and laughter. And I thought, this is what staying alive looks like. It doesn't always look like joy. It looks like mud on the floor, like dog hair on the couch, like crying at 2 a.m. and still making breakfast the next day. It looks like him and me, still here, together.